We're going to talk about measuring money, and we're going to use the medium of exchange function as the key determinant of what is money. Now, the Federal Reserve uses different measures, and the two basic measures we're going to talk about are M1 and M2. There was a measure called M3, but unfortunately the Fed stopped measuring it some years ago, and we'll talk about that in future. You see there a graph of M1 since 1960, and you see that around the time of the Great Recession there's a big upward bump in the money supply. That reflects the behavior of the Federal Reserve, which was trying to stimulate the economy, or at least prevent the recession from getting worse, by injecting money into the economy. By the way, who is Fred? Fred is the economic research database for the Federal Reserve System, and this database is maintained by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And this is a phenomenal resource to easily obtain macroeconomic data of all kinds. The FRED database uses a menu-driven system where you just tap what sort of data you want, tell it to create a graph with a few clicks, and there you have it. In 1 minute you can generate a really nice graph of pretty much any kind of macroeconomic or financial data going back as long as you like to the time that the data was first collected. It would save you tremendous time to use FRED whenever possible. I want to emphasize how easy FRED is to use. That is why I'm showing you another screenshot. You see there the menu for creating a graph. You tap, choose the data you want, the data series you want. You can even choose basic things about the graph design, like the lines that are going to be used, the period of time you want to be covered. You tell it to export the graph and you're done. No special training required at all. So this is very useful, and it's very standard data source that you see used even by regular financial publications like the Wall Street Journal, for example. M1 is defined as currency in the hands of the public. The public means anyone outside the Federal Reserve. Plus traveler's checks. Traveler's checks are something you never see anymore these days, but we're just being thorough. Plus checking, also called demand, deposits, and other checkable deposits. The textbook gives you more detail on exactly what these things mean. Now, this is the most, what we call narrow definition of money. It's the strictest definition of money, the sort of asset that is the most liquid and the most used in transactions as a medium of exchange. Since this is the most strict definition of money, the M1 number will be smaller than any other money definition. M2 is equal to M1 plus small denomination time deposits, savings deposits, money market deposits, and retail money market mutual fund shares. The latter two items must have check writing privileges. So, M1 is a subset of M2, which means M2 must always be bigger than M1. Also, since we want to measure for a medium of exchange role, we require that money market deposits and retail money market mutual fund shares should have check writing privileges. If those two sorts of accounts did not have check writing privileges, they could not serve as a means of payment. So which measure of money is correct? Well, it depends on the problem under study. In the case of inflation, M2 does a pretty good job. Now let me point you to this Fred graph. M2 and M3 are closely correlated. M3 actually includes M2 as a subset. So the green line there is incorporating the red line thing M2. So don't worry about distinguishing between the red and the green in this diagram. Now what you see is when there is high money supply growth using M2 or M3 as your benchmark, inflation increases approximately 2 years later. And as you track down and across, you see that most of the time high increases in money supply growth cause the consumer price index, the CPI, to increase, but with a lag. They're not instantaneously similar. So historically speaking, M2, and remember we don't have M3 anymore, M2 does a tolerably good job of explaining inflation with one important condition. We have to be talking about large-scale inflation, high numbers of inflation. When you are working in the territory of 1% inflation, 2% inflation, 3% inflation, you no longer get such a good correlation. But when you're talking about 7% inflation, 10% inflation, or higher, then look for the money supply. Looking at the graph, you will see that the period between 1960 and 1990, it gives you the best correlation between money supply growth and CPI change. That's the period of high inflation. In later decades, inflation was lower and the money supply fluctuations are less closely correlated with what's going on. By the way, let's get a little bit political here. Look at the graph for 1980. That's the period, the year, when Jimmy Carter was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California. Jimmy Carter, the incumbent president, lost the election. Now look at the economic data. In 1980, inflation reached almost 15%. So are you surprised that Jimmy Carter lost the election? When economic conditions are that extreme, people are very unhappy and they will vote out the incumbent, whether or not the incumbent is responsible for their misfortunes. Macroeconomics is very political. If you screw up the macroeconomy, bad things happen not just to regular people, but also to those who are the incumbent political class. Finally, take note of those vertical gray bars. Just to repeat, those gray bars are periods of recession. Okay, so what's this one about? One of the things we do in this course is introduce you to good sources of information about money and banking and the economy, and these sources all have online manifestations, and those online versions have a lot of free articles, free stuff. In the United States, the number one best source for information about money, banking, finance, macroeconomics, and general economic policy stuff is the Wall Street Journal. So you need to be familiar with this publication. We are going to be using its material later. Finally, I'd mention a curiosity. The history of money is very interesting. There are a lot of great stories. Here's one story. When Australia used to have paper currency, the $10 paper note had on one side a picture of Francis Greenaway, who became famous as an architect in the early 1800s. He was originally sent to Australia as a convict. His crime? Forgery. See you next chapter.